The third morning of April, in the stable yard at Renfield Hall, a horse named Sabre put a groom into the gravel, and the whole household came out to watch him do it. The groom was a Yorkshire man of 40, with hands like harness leather, and he had been hired for this animal and no other. He lasted 4 seconds. The grey came up under him the way water comes up under a hull, and then there was no man in the saddle, only a man in the yard, on his back, blinking at a sky the color of weak tea. Nobody laughed. 12 people stood along the fence and not one of them laughed, because they had watched 3 men go down in a fortnight, and the arithmetic had stopped being funny. At the far end of the yard, half hidden behind a water butt, stood a girl in a grey stuff gown, with her sleeves pushed to the elbow and her forearms red from the wash copper. Her name was Anne Vesey. She was 23 years old. She scoured pots at Renfield Hall for £8 a year, and she was the only person at that fence who was not looking at the horse. She was looking at his ears. They were pinned flat, and then they were not. They came forward a 1/4 inch once, and went flat again. And Anne understood something in that 1/4 inch that nobody else in the yard understood, and she said nothing at all, because a kitchen girl who speaks in a stable yard is a kitchen girl who is spoken about. "That is the scullery creature," said Mrs. Deloney, the housekeeper, to the head groom, not troubling to lower her voice. "Send her back to the pots." Anne went back to the pots. She did not see the man on the steps of the hall see her go. She did not see him standing there in a coat 2 seasons old, one hand on the balustrade, his weight held carefully off his left leg, watching the water butt where a grey gown had been. That was the Viscount Ardenmere, and he had bought the grey for 140 guineas from an army sale at Ipswich. And every rider who had mounted him since had come off in under a minute, and the Viscount had not yet told a single soul why he had bought him at all. Renfield Hall, in that spring, was a house holding its breath. The old Viscount had died in November and left his son the title, the acres, and £11,000 of debt secured against them. And the new Viscount, Julian, had come home from a war he did not speak of to find a solicitor in the morning room with a schedule of dates. The first payment fell due at Michaelmas, £3,000. He had, by the reckoning of every man in the county, one asset that might be worth that money and one only, and it had just put a Yorkshire groom into the gravel. Anne knew the figure. Kitchen girls know every figure in a house because figures travel downward through a house faster than they travel up. She knew £3,000 the way she knew the weight of the copper. She had come to Renfield in October, on foot, from a village 9 miles east, with a letter of character from a dead man in her pocket, and nothing else. And she had asked for the lowest place in the house because the lowest place was the one nobody would look at twice. Her father had been a horsebreaker, not a gentleman's trainer. A horsebreaker on the Norfolk edge of things, who took the ruined ones and the ones nobody could sit, and who had taught his daughter before she was 10 years old that a horse does not fight a man. A horse fights a memory the man happens to be standing in front of. He had died in February of the previous year with his hand in hers and his breath gone thin as paper, and he had left her nothing but a leather noseband. He had plaited himself, soft as a glove from 30 years of use, which she kept rolled in a rag at the bottom of her box under the eaves. The kitchen at Renfield began at 4 in the morning. Anne raked the range, drew the water, scoured the pots the upper servants had left greased and cold, and by 7 she had the skin of her forearms boiled pink to the elbow. There were 9 copper pans in that kitchen, and she knew each one by its weight in her hands and by the particular way it fought the sand. The big preserving pan took 11 minutes. The stockpot took 20 and left a burn across the inside of her wrist every 3rd day, where the rim caught as she tipped it. She had stopped noticing the burn in December. That was the sort of thing a house did to a person, and it did it so slowly that the person could not say afterward. When it had happened, Mrs. Kemp, the cook, was not unkind. Mrs. Kemp was simply too tired to be anything. A woman of 60 with a bad hip and 31 years in that kitchen, who had long ago made a private peace with the fact that nobody upstairs would ever learn her Christian name. She let Anne take the scraps out to the yard herself at 10, which was the one arrangement in Anne's life that Anne had engineered on purpose, and she never once asked why a girl would volunteer for a walk in the rain with a bucket of peel. Mrs. Kemp did not ask questions. She had found that questions cost more than they returned. "You have the look of somebody counting," she said to Anne once in February, without turning from the range. "Counting what, Mrs. Kemp?" "That is what I should like to know," said Mrs. Kemp. That was the end of it, and she gave Anne the heel of the loaf, and said nothing further for a fortnight, because at 10 the gray was in the paddock. She never went to the fence. She stopped at the midden 20 yards off, with the bucket on her hip, and she stood still. That was all. She stood still, and she let him look at her, and she did not look back. And for 6 weeks she had done this every single morning, without one soul at Renfield Hall remarking on it, because nobody remarks on the movements of a scullery maid with a bucket. On the 4th morning of April, the day after the groom went down, the gray came to the fence wall. He came slowly, with his head low and his neck long, and he stopped with his nose a foot from the rail. And Anne stood 20 yards away with a bucket of potato peel on her hip and let him stand there. She did not move toward him. She counted her own breaths until she reached 40, and then she turned and walked back to the kitchen, and her hands were shaking so badly she dropped the bucket at the door. Something had been decided, and she had not decided it. The Viscount rode out at 11 that morning on a bay cob, going slow, and he passed the paddock, and he saw the gray standing at the rail with his ears forward facing the kitchen yard, and he pulled up. He sat there for perhaps a minute. Then he rode on and said nothing to anybody. And that afternoon he asked Mrs. Deloney a question so idle and so carefully constructed that she answered it without thinking twice. "The girl with the pail, in the yard at 10. Who is she?" "Vesey, my lord, scullery. A charity case from Little Marling, if I recall the letter." Mrs. Deloney's fan was at her hip, closed, tapping. "A nobody, my lord. Quite harmless." "Thank you," he said, the words level, and he went into the library and did not come out until dark. Understand what he was carrying. It would be some weeks before Anne understood it, and longer before the county did. Julian had bought Sabre at Ipswich in February from a sale of cavalry stock returned from the peninsula, and he had bought him because he had recognized him. Not the horse. The number. There had been a brand on the near shoulder, a regimental mark, and the number in it belonged to a troop that had been Julian's own, and the man who had ridden that gray out of Spain had been a lieutenant named Harry Vesey, and Julian had given the order that put him where the shot found him. That is the whole of it. He had ordered a man forward across an open place because the ground gave him no other choice, and the man had gone because he was that sort of man, and the horse had come back and the man had not. Julian had not been able to save him. He had been able only to buy the horse at a sale in February in the rain, for 140 guineas he did not have, and to bring him home to Renfield, and put him in a paddock and stand at the balustrade watching him, and not once in all those weeks saying the man's name aloud. He did not know that Harry Vesey had a sister. He did not know that a horsebreaker on the Norfolk edge had raised 2 children and taught them both the same trade, and that the son had taken it into the cavalry and the daughter had taken it into a scullery when the money ran out. He knew only that a horse nobody could sit had walked to a fence for a girl with a bucket. The trouble arrived on the 12th of April, in a phaeton, in the person of Mr. Crail, who held the paper on the debt, and who had a proposal. Mr. Crail was not a villain. He was a man of 50, in an excellent coat, who had lent money against Renfield's acres, because Renfield's acres were good security, and who now wished to be paid, and who had noticed a horse. He took the chair by the window without being asked twice, and he looked at the room while he settled his gloves across his knee, and the room told him everything. The good pictures were still on the walls. The silver was still on the sideboard. What was gone was the smell of a house with money in it, that particular warmth of wax and coal and a fire lit in a room nobody is sitting in, and Mr. Froff's. Crail had been in enough failing houses to smell its absinthe through a closed door. "I'm sorry for your father, my lord," he said, and meant it. He was very civil to me. He was also, if I may, an optimist about drainage. He explained then courteously, and with the care of a man who takes no pleasure in the explaining, that a grey, with that brand and that breeding, was worth 800 guineas to the right buyer if he could be ridden, and worth 90 to the knacker if he could not, and that Michaelmas was in 5 months and 18 days. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Numbers do not require volume. "He can be ridden," Julian said. "By whom, my lord?" Julian did not answer, and Mr. Bracht. Crail, who had good manners, let the silence sit exactly as long as it needed to sit, and then rose and named a day, the 1st of June. He would bring a buyer. If the horse went under saddle in front of that buyer, there would be 800 guineas and a great deal of breathing room. If he did not, Mr. Crail would take him in part settlement at knacker's price, and the settlement of the rest would proceed as the schedule required. 7 weeks. The house heard it before the door of the morning room had properly shut. By supper it was in the servants' hall, and Mrs. Deloney had a version of it that she delivered to the table with her chin up and her spoon paused. 800 guineas, she said, or the knacker, and no man in England able to sit him. It is a great pity his lordship did not spend the money on drainage. Anne sat at the low end of the table with her hands in her lap, and her heart going like a bird in a fist, and she said nothing. She had spent 3 years learning to say nothing. She was extremely good at it. She went up to the eaves at 10 o'clock, and she took the rag out of the bottom of her box, and unrolled it and looked at her father's noseband for a long while by one candle, and then she rolled it up again, and put it back, and lay down, and did not sleep. What she did instead of sleeping was arithmetic. If she went to the Viscount and said what she knew, she would be a scullery maid who had presumed. She would be turned off without a character, and a girl turned off without a character. In the spring of the year has 3 roads, and 2 of them end badly. If she did not go, the grey went to the knacker on the 1st of June, and the horse that had carried her brother out of Spain would be a hide and 100 weight of bone. She did not go. She did something smaller, which is what her father would have done. She began taking the scraps out at 4. Nobody is in a stable yard at 4 in the morning in April, except the horses and the birds. Anne came out with her bucket in the grey light, and she went to the paddock rail, and she did not touch the grey, and she did not speak to him. She sat down on an upturned trough with her back against the fence, facing away from him, and she stayed there 20 minutes, and then she went in and lit the range. The second morning he came and stood behind her. The 4th morning he breathed on the back of her neck, and she did not turn around. And her eyes were streaming, and she let them, and she said very quietly without turning, "You were his." The 7th morning she stood up slowly, and put her hand flat on his shoulder, on the brand, and he shivered from the wither to the flank and did not move. Julian saw the 11th morning. He had not slept either. He had come down at 4:30 to walk the leg that a French ball had spoiled at Salamanca, and he came around the corner of the tack room and stopped, because there was a girl in a grey gown standing at his horse's head, with both hands on the animal's face, and the horse had his forehead pressed against her chest like a dog. He stood in the dark of the doorway and he watched, and he did not announce himself, and he saw her mouth move without hearing what it said. He saw her hands. He saw the raw red of her wrists above the plain cuff, and the way the horse leaned into her, and he understood, with a clarity that put a hand around his throat, that this was not a knack, or a trick, or a piece of luck. This was somebody who had been taught. He stepped out into the light. The horse's head came up. Anne turned and saw the Viscount of Renfield standing 10 feet away in the half-dark, and every drop of blood in her body went somewhere else. "My lord," she said. She curtsied. It was, she thought afterward, the worst curtsy in the history of England. "Do not run," he said. She had not been going to run. She had been going to faint, possibly. 6 weeks, my lord. He has put 4 men in the gravel in 6 weeks. Yes, my lord. Julian came forward slowly and stopped at a distance that was proper because he was careful about that. Always, and would be careful about it for a long while yet. He looked at the horse, and the horse looked back at him, with his ears flat. "He hates me," Julian said. "No, my lord." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "He does not know you. That is not the same thing." Something moved in the Viscount's face and was put away again. "Explain it." And Anne Vesey, 23 years old, in a wet gown at 5 o'clock in the morning, made the decision that would remake her life, and she made it in about a second and a half. He was taught to go forward at a certain pressure, she said. Every man who has mounted him has taken the reins short and put a leg on him, because that is how a gentleman starts a horse. He does not read that as a request. He reads it as the last thing he was asked to do. Whatever that was, my lord, it went badly, and he has not been let out of it since. The yard was very quiet. "You are speaking of a war horse," Julian said. "I am speaking of a horse, my lord." He looked at her then properly for the first time, and Anne felt it go through her the way heat goes through cold hands, painful and welcome and impossible to hide from. She looked at the ground. Her pulse was in her throat, and her ears, and the back of her knees, and she was certain, absolutely certain, that he could hear it. "Go and eat something," he said, and turned and walked away. And Anne stood there with her hands shaking, and did not understand for a full minute that she had not been dismissed. The house understood before she did. Servants' halls are the fastest post in England. But by the 15th of April the arrangement was official, and it was official in the way such things are made official, which is to say the Viscount instructed the head groom that the scullery maid was to have the grey in the paddock for 1 hour each morning, and no man was to interfere. And the head groom told Mrs. Cinkin. Kemp and Mrs. Kemp told Mrs. Deloney, and Mrs. Deloney went very still, and then very pleasant. "How fortunate for you," she said to Anne in the passage outside the still-room, her voice honey and her eyes flat. "A scullery creature with the run of the yard," Anne said. "Yes, ma'am. You will want to be careful," said Mrs. Deloney, "of getting above yourself. The fall is longer than the climb. That was the first week." In the second week, Anne put her father's noseband on the grey. She had brought it down in her apron pocket, and she stood in the paddock, with it in both hands for 10 minutes before she used it, because using it meant admitting what she was doing, and once she admitted it, she could not unadmit it. Up to that morning she had been a servant, standing in a field. After that morning she was a breaker's daughter working a horse. There is no road back from that, and she knew it while she stood there, with the leather warming in her palms. It was plated leather, soft as a glove, with a worn place where a thumb had rested for 30 years. Her father had made it the year he married. He had plaited it out of 3 lengths of harness, hid in a kitchen in Little Marling with a candle going down beside him, and he had used it on every ruined animal that came into his yard for the rest of his life, and he had never once put it on a horse he did not intend to keep his word to. That was the part Anne had never been able to explain to anybody. It was not a piece of tack. It was a promise with a buckle on. She slipped it on over his nose, and he stood like a rock, and she led him twice round the paddock on a length of plough line, and he walked beside her shoulder with his head at her hip like a horse in a picture. On the second circuit, her eyes were streaming again, and she let them again, and she thought quite distinctly that her father would have liked this horse, and that he would have said the same thing about him that she had said to the Viscount, and that he would have said it in fewer words. Julian watched from the balustrade. He did not come down. In the 3rd week she long-reined him. She walked behind him at the length of 2 plough lines, with her hands low and quiet, and he went where the lines asked, and stopped where they stopped. And twice he swung his quarters and looked back at her over his shoulder, to see whether the swing would be punished. And it was not, and he did not swing again. The head groom watched that from the gate. His name was Bartle. Bunford. He had been at Renfield 40 years, and had put 2 of the 4 men into the gravel himself by ordering them up. And he had a Yorkshire man's opinion of what a scullery maid could teach him, which was nothing. "You have not asked him for anything yet," he said on the Thursday. "No, Mr. Bartle." "When do you mean to?" "When he asks me," Anne said, and Bartle looked at her for a while, and then went away and did not come back to the gate for 6 days. And when he came back, he brought a bucket of chop nobody had told him to bring. In the 4th week she lay across his back at the mounting block for the count of 10, and got off, and did it again, and got off, and did it 11 times. And on the 11th, he turned his head and put his nose against her boot. Her father had done that with a bay mare at Little Marling when she was 9, up and off, 40 times in a wet field, until the mare had been so bored by the business of being mounted that she forgot to object to it. It is not a trick. It is only patience with a plan behind it, which is the rarest thing in England. In the 5th week she rode him at a walk, twice around the paddock, in a grey gown with no saddle, and the head groom took his hat off without knowing he had done it, and stood there holding it in both hands like a man in a church. They were together in that paddock an hour a day for 5 weeks, and the Viscount came down out of the house on the 9th day and never stopped coming. And what happened between those two people in that time did not happen in words, because neither of them was permitted words. It happened in a hand at a gate latch, both hands arriving at once, and neither moving for a second longer than a second ought to be. It happened when she took the plough line from him and their fingers passed, and she felt it in her spine. It happened when he said, "Come inside," one evening in the rain, 4 words, an order, and she stood in the tack room with rain in her hair and her heart going, and he did not look at her, and did not look at her, and then did. Once, for the length of one breath, and looked away. It happened when she stumbled on the mounting block, and his hand closed on her elbow to steady her, and stayed there a fraction past necessity, and both of them heard that fraction, and neither of them named it. And on the 24th of May, in the tack room at dusk with the grey drowsing in the box behind them, he told her about her brother. He did not know he was telling her about her brother. He told her about a lieutenant, unnamed in an open place, and an order given because there was no other order to give, and a horse coming back alone with the stirrup swinging. He told her because she had asked him what the brand meant, and because it was dusk, and because he had not said any of it out loud in 3 years, and it had begun to poison him. Anne stood absolutely still while he spoke, and her face did not move. "I could not get to him," Julian said, and his voice was the same level voice he used for everything, and that was somehow the worst of it. "I have thought since that a better officer would have found another way across. I have not found one. I have looked for 3 years, there was not another way across," Anne said. He looked at her. "You are certain of that?" "Yes, my lord." Her hands were folded in front of her, and she was gripping her own fingers hard enough to bruise them. "Because if there had been, you would have found it. That is what you are." He did not move. Neither did she. The lamp guttered, and the horse shifted in the straw, and the distance between them was 4 feet, and it might as well have been a wall of glass. And Anne wanted, with a want so plain and so unsanctioned that it frightened her, to cross it. She did not cross it. Neither did he. That is the whole of the Regency in one sentence. His name was Vesey, Julian said. And Anne said, "I know, my lord," and walked out of the tack room into the dark, and he did not follow her, and it was 3 days before either of them slept properly again. He came to her on the 27th, in the paddock, with the letter of character in his hand. He had gone through the housekeeper's book. It had taken him 1 hour. "Little Marling," he said. "Vesey, daughter of Thomas Vesey, Breaker, sister of Harry." "Yes, my lord, you have known since February, since I saw the brand." "My lord, in October there was no brand to see. I came here for a place. I did not know he was here until he was. You have scoured my pots for 7 months. Somebody must, my lord." And the Viscount Ardmere laughed, 1 syllable entirely without warning, and put his hand over his mouth as though he had committed an offense, and Anne looked at him, and thought that if she died at that moment, she would not have much to complain of. Then Mrs. Purr. Deloney came round the corner of the tack room with a second post in her hand and saw a Viscount and a scullery maid standing 4 feet apart in a paddock laughing, and every calculation in that woman's head reordered itself in about a second. The letter went to Mr. Crail. It was a perfectly polite letter. It observed that his lordship's arrangements for the Grey had come to depend upon a domestic of no standing, and that a prudent creditor might wish to satisfy himself as to the security of his interest. Mr. Blumene. Crail arrived on the 30th of May, 2 days early, with the buyer and with company. He had brought Sir Rowland Vane, who wanted the horse, and Sir Rowland had brought his sister, Lady Constance Vane, who had wanted Renfield Hall and its Viscount since the previous autumn, and had been told all her life that she was the correct choice, and Mrs. Deloney had seen to it that the drawing-room was full. 14 people, the rector, 2 neighboring families, the head groom, standing at the door with his hat in his hands because he had been summoned and did not know why. They stood on the gravel in front of the paddock at 11 in the morning on the last day of May, and Mr. Crail, who was not a villain, said the thing that had to be said. "My lord, I am obliged to establish the fact of the matter. The animal goes under saddle today before witnesses, or he goes to Bexley's yard tomorrow at 90 guineas. Who will ride him?" And Mrs. Deloney, standing at the edge of the gravel with her hands folded at her waist, said clearly to the rector's wife, in the voice one uses for a remark one wishes to be overheard. The scullery creature, of course. His lordship's scullery creature. 14 people turned to look at Anne, standing at the paddock gate in a grey stuff gown with her sleeves pushed up and her forearms boiled pink to the elbow. Lady Constance smiled. It was not a cruel smile. That was the worst of it. It was a smile of genuine, uncomplicated pity. The smile of a woman looking at a thing that had wandered into a room where it did not belong. "Poor creature," she said. Somebody ought to have told her. Anne felt the gravel under her boots and the sun on her neck, and she understood with total clarity exactly what she was in that yard. 14 people had just agreed on it out loud, and the agreement had been so easy, so unanimous, so entirely without malice, that there was no arguing with it. You cannot argue with weather. She looked at her own hands. They were the hands of somebody who scoured 9 copper pans a day. Red to the second knuckle, 1 nail gone black in March from the lid of the stockpot, and every person on that gravel had seen them and drawn the correct conclusion, which was that these were not the hands of a woman who rides. And the horse behind her was going to Bexley's yard in the morning. She let herself see it, because she had never been a coward about seeing things. The van, the ramp, the particular noise a Grey makes going up a ramp he does not like. 11 weeks of 4 o'clock mornings and a man's whole voice coming out of a horse's ears, and then 90 guineas and a hide. There was not one thing in the world she could do about it. A kitchen girl cannot ride a horse in front of 14 people. If she tried, and he threw her, they would carry her out on a hurdle, and the horse would be worth 90 guineas instead of 800, and Renfield would go under, and the Viscount would be the man who lost his father's acres, because he had let a scullery maid put her hands on his only asset. And every one of these 14 faces would carry that story into every drawing-room in the county by Sunday. And it would all be her fault, and it would be true. That was the thing that took her legs from under her, not the shame. The arithmetic of it. She looked for the Viscount. He was on the steps, and he had not moved, and his face was ice over a river. Her hand went to her apron pocket where a plaited noseband lay rolled in a rag, and she thought about her father and about a boy on a fence at Little Marling teaching her that a horse fights a memory. And she thought quite calmly, "I do not need them to let me, Mr. Crail," she said. Her voice came out clear. 14 people heard it. I will want the gate opened, and everyone off the rail, and no one is to speak until I am up. The silence that followed was the silence of 14 well-bred people, who have just been given an order by a servant. Mr. Crail, to his considerable credit, opened the gate. She went in with the noseband in her hand. She did not hurry. She walked to the middle of the paddock and stopped and stood with her back half turned, and the Grey came across the grass to her, the way he had come across it every morning for 11 weeks, head low, neck long, and put his forehead against her chest. Somebody on the rail made a small sound. Anne slipped the noseband on. She ran her palm down the brand on his shoulder, and she said one thing to him that nobody outside that paddock ever heard. And then she took 2 fistfuls of mane and went up onto his back. In one movement, no saddle, no stirrup, her skirt bunched to the knee, and not a soul in that yard thinking about her ankles. Sabre stood. Then he walked. He walked the length of the paddock with his ears forward and his head at the height of a horse, who has nothing in the world to be afraid of, and he turned at the far rail without being asked, and came back, and went past 14 silent people at a trot, as level as a table. Horse, well. And Anne sat him with her raw red hands loose on his neck, and her chin up, and did not look at one of them. She halted him in front of the steps. "Sir Roland," Vane said into the silence. 800. I will take him today. And Julian came down the steps. He came down all 7 of them, and out across the gravel, and he did not stop at the proper distance, and Anne slid down off the gray's back, and her feet hit the ground. And he was there, close enough that she had to look up. The whole yard was watching. Mrs. Deloney's hands had come apart at her waist. Lady Constance's smile had not moved and had stopped meaning anything. "The horse is not for sale," Julian said, "nor is the woman I intend to marry." 11 words. He said them at a normal volume, in the level voice, the way a man states the time. Nobody spoke. Somewhere behind the stables a blackbird went on singing, which felt, to Anne, like an impertinence. Then Mr. Bice. Crail, who was not a villain and who had watched a kitchen girl put her hand on a warhorse's brand, and then put herself on his back in front of a crowd that had just called her a creature, took his hat off. "My lord," he said, "I find the security of my interest is very much improved." He turned to Sir Roland. "The animal is not on the market, Sir Roland. I am at your disposal for the drive back." Lady Constance Vane looked at her brother, and at the Viscount, and at Anne, and something went across her face that was, for one honest instant, recognition. She inclined her head. Half an inch. It cost her a great deal. "My lord," she said. "Miss Vesey." It was the first time in 7 months that anybody at Renfield Hall had said her name with a miss in front of it, and Anne's eyes went, and she could not stop them, and she stood in the gravel in a wet gray gown and let them. "Mrs." Deloney said, "My lord, I am sure I never—" She stopped. She began again. "My lord, if I had understood—" She stopped again, and her hands did not know where to be, and the rector's wife looked at the sky, and it was over. She was not turned off. Julian did not turn her off then or later. She went to his sister's house at Alderby in September, at her own request, and was, by every account, perfectly comfortable there, and never once in her life afterward used the word creature about anybody. The horse was put back in the paddock. The people went away, which took an hour, because people always take an hour. And at 6 o'clock that evening Anne was in the tack room, because she did not know where else to be, and Julian came in, and shut the door and stood with his back against it. 11 weeks, he said. "And you did not tell me." "I could not, my lord." "Julian." Anne put her hand out, and steadied herself on the wall, and her breath went out of her all at once, and she said, "Julian." And it came out badly, and he crossed the room. He stopped with perhaps 6 inches between them. He did not touch her. His hand came up and hovered at her jaw, close enough that she felt the warmth of it against her skin without contact, and he held it there, and neither of them breathed. "I have wanted this," he said, "since the 11th of April in the dark at 4:30, and I have not permitted myself the thought." "Nor I," Anne said. Her voice was almost nothing. "That is a lie." "I have permitted myself the thought a great deal." Then he kissed her, and it was soft, and it was full of promise, and it was the end of a very long silence on both sides, and it did not go further than that, because there was a whole life after it, and neither of them was in any hurry now. They were married in the parish church at Renfield on the 11th of September, 3 weeks before Michaelmas. And there were 11 people present, and one of them was the head groom. The debt was met. Not by the Grey, in the end. It was met by 3 seasons of the Grey's foals out of the county's mares, at 40 guineas a covering, because a viscountess who had been a horsebreaker's daughter knew exactly what an unrideable war-horse was worth once he had been ridden in front of witnesses. Mr. Crail extended the schedule himself, and made money on it, and considered it the best morning's work of his professional life. The first snow came in December. Anne was in the paddock at 4 in the afternoon with the light going blue, and the Grey came across to her through it, with his breath standing white around his head, and she had her hands in her sleeves against the cold, and she took one out to touch him. Julian watched from the balustrade, and then he did not watch from the balustrade, because he came down. They stood at the rail together in the snow, a viscount and his wife, and neither of them said anything, and behind them the windows of Renfield Hall were coming up gold, one at a time, as the maids went round with the tapers. The horse put his head over the rail between them, and stood. And on the leather of his noseband, plaited by a man in Norfolk 30 years before, worn soft as a glove, there was a place where a thumb had rested for a lifetime, and Anne's thumb was in it. She left it there a long while,